Marcus Green has always believed that his garden was more than just a patch of earth. It was his sanctuary, a living canvas of nature nurtured over years of careful tending. A retired horticulturist with a gentle soul and a passion for organic gardening, Marcus now spends his days cultivating vibrant blooms, aromatic herbs, and a cornucopia of vegetables on his charming suburban property in Willow Bend. Every inch of his garden, from the winding stone path to the weathered wooden trellis, speaks of a legacy of hard work and a deep respect for nature's rhythms. For Marcus, gardening is not merely a hobby, it's a way of life. It represents the freedom he earned after a long career, a peaceful retreat from the rigors of the past, and a living expression of his creativity and independence. His prized roses, heirloom tomatoes, and fragrant lavender beds are a testament to his dedication, a colorful rebellion against the bland uniformity of modern life. But not everyone in Willow Bend shares Marcus's vision of natural beauty. At the helm of the Homeowners Association HOA is Kerren, a self-appointed enforcer with a penchant for rigidity. Known for her perfectly ironed blouses, an ever-present clipboard, and an unyielding adherence to community standards, Kerren has long made it her mission to police every detail of the neighborhood. To her, every lawn must be trimmed to perfection, and every garden curated to a sterile ideal. Marcus's wild, thriving garden, bursting with color and life, is anathema to her vision of suburban order. The first real confrontation occurred on a bright spring morning when Marcus discovered that his carefully arranged garden path, lined with a medley of wildflowers and soft moss, had been repeatedly trampled. As he knelt to inspect the damage, he saw Kerren striding toward him with an expression of smug superiority. "Marcus," she said in a clipped tone, "your garden is a disgrace. The paths should be neat and orderly, not a mess of unapproved, wild growth and chaos. I'm issuing you a final warning. Fix this or face the consequences." Marcus's heart sank. "Kerren, I've worked hard to create a space that celebrates natural beauty. I'm not trying to be untidy. I'm trying to bring life and creativity to this neighborhood." But Kerren's eyes were cold and unyielding. "Rules are rules. Your failure to conform undermines our community's aesthetic. You have 1 week to correct this, or you'll be fined." A small group of neighbors watched the exchange in hushed awe. In that moment, Marcus realized that Kerren's overreach wasn't limited to petty criticisms. It was a full-scale attempt to impose a sanitized, rigid order on the very essence of his life. Determined not to let her trample his hard-won freedom, Marcus silently vowed that he would protect his garden at all costs, even if it meant taking matters into his own hands. The following morning, Marcus found a new indignity waiting on his front door, a pristine envelope bearing the official seal of Willow Bend's HOA. Inside, a fine of $750 for violating community landscaping regulations was detailed in dense, intimidating legal language, an unmistakable message that Kerren was ready to enforce her rules by any means necessary. Outside, Kerren was already waiting at the gate, arms crossed and a self-satisfied smirk on her face. "Remember, Mr. Green," she said coolly, "the rules apply to everyone in Willow Bend. Your inability to maintain a perfectly manicured garden not only disrupts our community's image, but also sets a dangerous precedent." Fuming yet determined, Marcus gathered all his property deeds, garden design plans, and testimonials from neighbors who appreciated his creative approach to landscaping. Later that day, he visited the local zoning office. A sympathetic official assured him that there were no ordinances preventing him from designing his garden as he wished, though the officer warned that the HOA was notorious for stretching regulations to suit its own agenda. Despite the reassurance, the pressure intensified. Early the next morning, unannounced inspectors arrived at Marcus's property with clipboards in hand. They measured his garden paths, inspected his flower beds, and peppered him with questions about his landscaping choices. Every invasive visit felt like a deliberate attempt to break his spirit. That evening, at an emergency HOA meeting held in the cold, fluorescent-lit community center, Kerren took the stage. "Effective immediately," she declared with unwavering authority. "Any homeowner who fails to comply with our community standards will face additional fines and legal action." The declaration sent a shiver through the room, leaving many residents visibly anxious, while Marcus's determination grew even stronger. In the days that followed, Kerren's tactics grew ever more aggressive. Neighbors began whispering about fines for the smallest infractions, a slightly overgrown hedge here, an unapproved wildflower bed there. It became painfully clear that Kerren's mission was to impose a uniform, sterile order on every property in Willow Bend, regardless of personal taste or tradition. Determined not to let her crush his creative spirit, Marcus installed discreet security cameras around his garden, focusing especially on the paths, flower beds, and areas most vulnerable to trampling. Night after night, he reviewed the footage and soon noticed a disturbing pattern. Inspectors and even casual passers-by, often accompanied by Kerren herself, would trample his carefully nurtured garden as if it were an open invitation to enforce conformity. Late one evening, while compiling what he began calling the Garden Freedom Files, Marcus received a confidential tip from a disillusioned board member. Fines mysteriously vanish when homeowners make large donations to the HOA fund, the tip whispered. It's not about protecting our community. It's about consolidating power and profit. Marcus's heart pounded. This wasn't merely about a few trampled flowers. It was systemic corruption, and Kerren was at its center. Every new piece of evidence, photographs, video clips, and testimonies from similarly aggrieved neighbors, only deepened his resolve. The Garden Freedom Files became his secret arsenal, a binder of proof that he would one day use to expose the abusive practices of the HOA. Marcus knew that if he was to defend his creative sanctuary, he needed to launch a counterattack that would force the entire community to confront Kerren's overreach. One cool morning, Marcus awoke to a shocking sight. Heavy machinery had been parked at the edge of his garden, and sections of his beloved flower beds had been flattened and repaved with cold, gray concrete. The HOA claimed these modifications were necessary for community safety and to prevent further violations, but Marcus saw it for what it was, a direct assault on his right to cultivate beauty and individuality. Enraged by the blatant intrusion, Marcus gathered every scrap of evidence from his Garden Freedom Files and prepared for a public confrontation. At the next HOA meeting, held in the stark institutional atmosphere of the community center, Marcus strode to the podium with unwavering determination. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what you're about to see is undeniable evidence of abuse of power, a violation of our right to live and express ourselves freely on our own property." He proceeded to project a series of video clips that captured unannounced inspections, invasive trampling of his garden by Kerren and her enforcers, and snippets of off-the-record conversations among board members discussing kickbacks and arbitrary fines. As the footage played, the room fell into a heavy silence. Neighbors began to murmur their own stories of minor but relentless invasions into their personal spaces. Then, with a hint of defiant mischief, Marcus unveiled his countermeasure. "Since Kerren insists on trampling my garden to enforce her vision of order, I've decided to reclaim my space in a way she won't soon forget." He explained that, over several nights, he had deliberately planted patches of poison ivy along the main garden path, exactly where Kerren and her cronies would tread whenever they visited. "Now, every time you try to enforce your rules on my garden," he said with a wry smile, "you'll get a little taste of nature's revenge." A ripple of laughter and applause swept through the room. Kerren's face darkened, but she refused to back down. The room had clearly shifted. What was once a battle of wills was now a full-scale uprising against arbitrary control, and Marcus's ingenious act of resistance had sparked a turning point. Cornered by mounting evidence and the resounding support of her neighbors, Kerren resorted to a final, desperate gambit. Late one humid evening, with tensions reaching a boiling point, she decided to call the police, alleging that Marcus's garden had become a public nuisance due to the unsanctioned, hazardous nature of his landscaping modifications. Her claim was outrageous, an attempt to intimidate Marcus and reassert her authority by involving law enforcement. Within minutes, uniformed officers arrived at Marcus's property. Standing calmly among his rows of blooming flowers and carefully cultivated patches of poison ivy, Marcus greeted them and, with measured resolve, presented his credentials as a longtime resident and community advocate. "There is no public nuisance here," he explained evenly. This is my private garden, and I have every right to manage it as I see fit, even if that means letting a little poison ivy grow along the path." The officers, recognizing the absurdity of the claim, left after issuing a stern warning to Kerren about misusing emergency services. Unwilling to let her anger subside, Kerren escalated her covert operations further by hiring a private investigator to catch Marcus in any compromising act that might justify further sanctions. However, thanks to the newly installed security cameras, every furtive move of the PI was captured on film as he lurked near the garden. The footage clearly showed him trespassing on Marcus's property, a blatant violation of his rights. At the next HOA meeting, a session Kerren had meticulously planned to regain control, Marcus unveiled the damning evidence. He projected the security footage onto a large screen for all the residents to see. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as Kerren's final, desperate move was exposed in full detail. Her face turned crimson with humiliation, and it was evident that her attempt to intimidate was crumbling under the weight of the truth. In a final act of defiance, Marcus announced that he had formally reported the trespassing incident to local law enforcement, ensuring that Kerren's blatant abuse of power would be permanently on record. The assembled homeowners erupted in applause, and it became unmistakably clear: Kerren's days of unchecked authority were numbered. In the wake of Marcus's explosive confrontation at the HOA meeting, the atmosphere in Willow Bend began to shift dramatically. The community, long subdued by arbitrary fines and invasive inspections, now buzzed with a united spirit of defiance and renewal. An emergency meeting convened by a coalition of outraged homeowners, the damning evidence of unauthorized trampling, invasive modifications to private property, and Kerren's desperate maneuvers was presented in excruciating detail. With overwhelming support from the residents, a decisive vote was taken, and the outcome was unanimous. Kerren was removed from the HOA board. The decision sent shockwaves throughout the neighborhood. Within days, local authorities launched a comprehensive investigation into the HOA's practices, revealing a systematic pattern of arbitrary fines, financial mismanagement, and blatant abuse of power. The oppressive structure that Kerren had so zealously defended began to crumble under the weight of undeniable evidence, and the collective will of a community no longer willing to be controlled. For Kerren, the consequences were swift and severe. Her personal assets, once paraded as symbols of her authority, fell under intense scrutiny, and financial irregularities came to light. Her once impeccable home was swiftly put on the market, and she quickly became a cautionary tale of unchecked entitlement and abuse of power. Marcus, watching these developments from the sanctuary of his flourishing garden, felt an overwhelming sense of vindication. His battle to protect his garden and his inventive act of planting poison ivy along the path had ignited a movement that reclaimed the rights of every homeowner in Willow Bend. Neighbors, emboldened by their shared victory, began sharing their own stories of past grievances and envisioning a future free from arbitrary control. As the old HOA structure disintegrated, new policies were swiftly enacted, ones built on transparency, accountability, and genuine respect for individual freedoms. Marcus's creative counterattack had become a rallying cry for community independence, and his garden now stood as a proud testament to the triumph of nature and individuality over bureaucratic tyranny. With a contented smile and a cup of herbal tea in hand, he watched as the remnants of Kerren's oppressive reign faded into memory. With the community uprising in full swing and the corrupt practices of the old HOA exposed beyond dispute, local authorities had no choice but to take decisive legal action. Investigations into the invasive inspections, arbitrary fines, and overall abuse of power revealed that the rules enforced by the HOA were nothing more than a facade for personal gain. The city imposed steep fines on the HOA for violating homeowners' rights, and a class action lawsuit was swiftly filed on behalf of the aggrieved residents. At a press conference held in the newly reformed community center, Marcus stood before a crowd of reporters and relieved neighbors. "Today we've proven that no one is above the law," he declared in a measured tone. "Our community will no longer be held hostage by arbitrary rules and unchecked power." This legal victory marks the beginning of a new era for Willow Bend. As court dates were set and legal documents piled up, individual board members began facing personal legal consequences for their roles in the oppression. Even Kerren's longtime legal advisor was scrutinized for his complicity in the HOA's unethical practices. The collapse of the old system was not merely symbolic. It was a comprehensive legal reckoning that sent a clear message to communities everywhere. Fairness, transparency, and respect for individual rights must prevail. For Marcus, this legal triumph was the final power move, a vindication of his long-fought battle against tyranny. The class action lawsuit not only promised financial restitution for the wronged homeowners, but also paved the way for a complete overhaul of community governance. Willow Bend was now poised to enter a future defined by respect, cooperation, and true neighborly spirit. As the legal and public consequences mounted, Kerren's personal life began to unravel in spectacular fashion. Once the unyielding enforcer of Willow Bend's arbitrary rules, she soon found herself isolated, ridiculed, and financially ruined. The scandalous spectacle of her trampling Marcus's garden and her repeated incursions into his sanctuary turned her once formidable reputation into a public laughingstock. Within weeks, her prized sedan was repossessed amid mounting debts, and whispers of personal turmoil spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Rumors of a crumbling marriage and the collapse of her once impeccable authority became common fodder for gossip. The very system she had championed to enforce conformity now turned against her, leaving her as a stark example of unchecked entitlement run amok. In a final bitter twist, Kerren attempted to salvage her reputation by seeking employment in property management. Instead, she was offered an entry-level position as an assistant property manager for another HOA, a public admission of her dramatic fall from grace. At a local networking event, a former neighbor couldn't resist quipping, "I hope you enjoy following the rules now, Kerren." The remark, laced with humor and triumph, encapsulated her complete and humiliating collapse. Marcus, watching these developments from the tranquil refuge of his garden, now safe from relentless trampling and protected by his clever poison ivy barrier, felt a deep sense of poetic justice. His battle had never been solely about preserving his beloved garden. It was about defending his right to live freely, without interference from those who sought to impose arbitrary control. Kerren's humiliating downfall, documented in every piece of evidence and echoed in the laughter of her former enforcers, served as a powerful reminder that unchecked entitlement eventually crumbles under the weight of truth and community unity. In the months following Kerren's dramatic downfall, Willow Bend transformed into a community reborn. The dark days of arbitrary fines, invasive inspections, and oppressive rules gave way to an atmosphere of creativity, collaboration, and genuine respect for individual freedoms. Neighbors gathered for impromptu garden parties, seasonal festivals, and lively block gatherings where the spirit of independence was celebrated with unbridled joy. Marcus, whose garden had once been under constant threat from Kerren's trampling and petty fines, now enjoyed his sanctuary in peace. At a spirited neighborhood celebration honoring their reclaimed rights, a jovial resident presented him with a handmade HOA violation notice for excessive poison ivy planting. The crowd erupted in laughter as Marcus held the sign high and remarked with a wry smile, "They really tried." As dusk settled over Willow Bend and the soft glow of twilight danced over the blooming garden paths, the memory of oppressive rule faded into a distant echo. The community had reclaimed not only its rights, but its spirit, a spirit that celebrated individuality, nurtured creativity, and defied conformity at every turn. In that final, golden moment of celebration, as neighbors toasted to their victory and laughter filled the warm evening air, the screen of a once oppressive era faded to black, a final mic drop that signaled the ultimate triumph of a united community over entitlement.